All right, so what I wanted to look at today is refactoring our rigid body character controller a little bit to make the code easier to read and easier for other people to follow along with, just as a step before we add any extra functionality and things start to kind of get crazy. So right now there's not a ton in here, but what we're going to do is begin adding animations and maybe some other functionality. And the more we add, the more this is going to get difficult to parse through. So we will benefit from taking steps to make it easier to read. So what kind of steps could that be? Well, first of all, for serialized fields, I recommend that we put tooltips on anything that might be unclear. You know, our first line of defense is good names. And then after that, we can document things. So we will document our serialized fields with tooltips. And then after that, we can document our methods with summary tags. Now, here's, I guess, an example of a summary tag. I don't want to put a summary tag on fixed update and start, because these are actually, you know, what's called a Unity message. They're part of the Unity API, meaning the Unity engine is going to send a message to our mono behaviors and essentially call these methods at specific points. So start already means something to Unity, and I'm not going to change what start means. And furthermore, no one is ever going to call start on these besides the game engine itself. So when we add a summary, we're kind of adding documentation for people who are going to use these methods so they understand what they're for. So if you put 3 forward slashes in Visual Studio, at least, you'll get the code snippet like to automatically add a summary tag. And what I want to do for onMove here, if you remember, this is what gets called by, if I find our player, this gets called by the player input component on the player using the new input system. So remember, if we expand events here, we get events for each of the things set up in our input that we set up, our input actions here. So you can see there's move, look, fire. So we have an event that represents whenever the move input occurs. And on our player here, that is handled by this invoke Unity events. And we go down and we expand player, and we can see when the move event happens, we're going to call the onMove method inside of our player rigid body character controller script here. And I guess I would say, I'm going to double click the name of the script here to pop back in here. If you're just looking at the code side of things, that might not be so evident. It's maybe difficult to understand what is calling onMove. If I were to like go to this, right click and choose find all references, it's going to come up with nothing, and you'd be like, I guess this isn't used, let's delete it, and then everything would be broken. So this is a good one, I think, to add a summary to kind of explain what's going on here. And so we can just say something like this event handler is called from the, I already forget what that component's called, I'm not used to the new input system yet, player input. So it's called from the player input component. Using the new input system. All right, so that hopefully will explain a little bit about how this magic is happening. And we can explain a little bit about context, which is the parameter here. This is going to be a vector2. Again, this is all defined. If we go back into our input folder and double click this, you can see move, and it's a vector2 control. And so all of the input events just take this parameter called context. And the only way to know what that is to look here. because it could be different for any of them. There's like a drop down value, drop down menu here, and you can pick anything. So in order to clarify what it's supposed to be, I will explain this is a vector 2 representing the move input. That's clear enough. All right. And so now we've kind of helped explain our game and how it works a little bit. Now, again, we can't put summaries for start and fixed update because that's like, you should just know what start and fixed update are if you are a Unity developer. But you might say something like, well, look at all this complex coding that's happening in here. If we don't put a summary, how is anybody going to understand what it is? And so what I would recommend that we do is we kind of like our first line of defense here was coming up with good names for things. Right now, we just have this giant block of code that doesn't really have a name. So what we should do is identify where we can come up with distinct blocks of logic that are all trying to accomplish one specific goal, extract it out of fixed update and into its own new method that will have its own name explaining what that code does, and then add a summary to that, and we can call that new method from inside of fixed update. So if I look at this, we kind of have this first part of our code that is creating a vector 3 for input and then adjusting it based on the camera so that the player can move in a direction relative to the camera's rotation. So that if you press forward, you're not moving based on the characters forward or the world's forward, or you're moving based on the camera's forward, which is just generally helps. It's kind of a more intuitive way of dealing with that. So that's this chunk. Then if I look over here, this is where we are adjusting the physics material based on whether we think the player's trying to stop or move so that they have better friction or more suitable friction based on what they're trying to do. And so that's only one line of code. And then next we have this part, which is actually moving the player. So this is our code that's actually moving. And then finally we have this code, which is rotating the player in order to face the direction that they're moving. Or I guess it's going to face the direction that the player is pushing input-wise. So those are kind of all of the separate, distinct concepts that are all encompassed within fixed update right now. And sort of similar to this idea of separation of concerns, which normally you might think of in an object-oriented context, like each object should only do one thing. Well, each method should kind of only do one thing as well, and it should do what its name says. So we want to break fixed update up into a handful of unique methods with names that clearly explain what the method does. So the first one will be here, where we are getting the movement input and converting it into a camera relative vector 3. So normally my go-to for this would be to select the lines of code and hit Control period, and then go to extract method. And it pretty much does exactly what I said I want to do. The only reason I'm skeptical about it is you can see it's like going to have out parameters is the way that they're suggesting that we do this, which I think is kind of like overcomplicated, because like really we're only going to ever use this method in this one spot. So I think what we should do, I guess that sort of made sense because we need to know this variable for other purposes, or at least we need to know that this variable we're going to use in a bunch of spots. So what I think unfortunately, we can't really do it the way that Unity or Visual Studio rather wanted to kind of automatically do it in this case. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control X, and I'm going to type a function here, something like vector3 camera relative input this thing. I'm just going to copy. Oh, shoot. I don't want to copy because then I'll lose my huge block of code that I selected earlier. All right. So I'm going to have to type that in by hand. Vector3 camera relative input direction equals get camera relative input direction. And so this is a method that doesn't exist yet. And so what I can do is hit Control period now, and I can generate a method for it. So I'm going to click that right now. And so here it is. It's just an empty method with a signature that will return a vector3 because that's the data type that I set here. And so I'm going to get rid of this not implemented exception that Visual Studio just stubs in when you use that shortcut to make a method. And I'm going to hit Control V. Hopefully you still have this all saved. If not, you can do what I did earlier and hit Control Z a bunch of times until you get a chance to copy it again. And now it's all pasted in, but it's underlined in red because this thing we've said has to return a vector3. So what I can do right here is I'm going to slightly adjust this a little bit, and I guess I'll say something like, I guess I'll just say return. Well, why don't I say this? I'll add a new line at the end, and I'll say return this. Now it's a little, you kind of want to make sure that this is, when I select this, you can see it's highlighting that because we have the same name situation happening here where this variable has the same name. So you can clarify which one you're talking about with the this keyword, but I don't need to do that here because if I select it, I can see it's working. If I want to maybe make it a little less confusing, I could add something to the end like to return or something like that, and I'll hit I'll change the name of this here, camera relative input direction to return. It's kind of a mouthful, but I guess it helps clarify the difference between this one. And so now I have this here, and this is now named in a clear way, so I understand what this method is doing. It's getting the camera relative input direction. And what I want to do, I think, is add a summary to explain what this is for or what it's doing. So it's going to say that it uses the input vector to create a camera relative version so the player can move based on the camera. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know. Maybe there's a better way to word that, but at least I think the name itself is going to go a long way here. All right. And then what is this thing returning? It's just going to return the camera relative input direction, which it's kind of self-evident. All right. And so now the nifty thing is if you were to mouse over this function that we wrote, it'll tell you the documentation for it that we just wrote right here. So that's pretty neat. That's why the summary is a little bit better than just a regular old comment because of this feature. So next we see this guy is underlined in red, and I guess it's because the input direction is a variable that we have here, and so it only exists inside of this method, and we can't use it here anymore. But we don't really need to use it here. We actually could just use this vector2 for the input that we have that gets updated when the player moves the joystick. So what I'm just going to do here is change this to input, which is the name of that other variable, and it's the same effect. We just want to figure out here, is the player pushing the move buttons at all or not? Because if they're pushing the move buttons, we want to apply this physics material, and if they're not, we want to apply that physics material. Now, this is one line of code, and so I normally wouldn't necessarily recommend putting it in its own method, but in this case I'm gonna, just so I can kind of give a name to this line of code. So I'm gonna hit control period, I'm gonna go to extract method, and this time I can use the nice extract method feature, and I just need to type the name of the method. You can see what it did is it just put that line of code I had selected in the new method. So the next thing I do is just type the name of the new method. So what is this method doing? It is updating the physics material is what it's doing. So I'm going to say update physics material. And then this one I'll give a summary to explain kind of what that is about. And so updates the physics material to a low friction option if the player is moving, or a high friction option if they're trying to stop. All right, so now we have hopefully clarified what these two things are doing. Now, next we have this. So this is what I said. We're actually adding force to the player based on the direction they need to move in, their acceleration, and their max speed. So I'm just going to select these lines, hit control period. So I've got this new method that's going to take a vector3, and I think that's okay. So I'm going to hit extract method, and I'm going to just call this thing move, I think, because that's what it's doing. This is how our character moves. But I want to change the name of the parameter here. I'm going to change this to move direction, and because that's kind of what it is. Oops, I did not mean to hit return there. What I meant to do was hit control period and rename this variable, but kind of once you get off of it, you lose that option and you have to just copy and paste like I did there. So anyway, move direction I think is a better name for the parameter here, because what the move function is going to do is move the character in this direction based on its max speed and its acceleration. So that is exactly what I'm going to put in this summary. Moves the player I'll say in a direction based on its max speed and acceleration. All right, and then we can explain what move direction is in case you don't get it. The direction to move in. And now, anytime somebody ever tries to call move, they will see what it does. All right. So what else is happening in fixed update? I'm going to get rid of the extra lines here. Now that things are kind of simplified, I think it's less necessary to space things out. And here, the last bit of code, what this guy is doing is rotating our player to face the direction that that the player is trying to move in. So I'm going to highlight that, hit Control period, press Enter to extract the method, and I'm going to give this thing a name, and I'm going to say rotate to face movement direction. Or maybe I should call it input direction. Because, like, I guess the reason I'm clarifying that is, like, let's say something pushes my player. You could say the player is moving when it got pushed, but we wouldn't want to rotate to face the direction it's moving in. In that case, what we're doing is we're rotating to face the move input direction. So maybe I'll go even further. Okay, so rotate to face move input direction. Now, if you think that's confusing, add a summary. What's this thing doing? It's just turning the player. We might want to use this thing on something that's not the player one day. So I'm going to try to avoid the player talk a little bit in case we ever use this, repurpose it for AI or something. Turn the character face the direction it is. And I'm going to change the name of this parameter because it doesn't necessarily need to be camera relative input. We're just going to say movement direction. And this time I'll hit Control period right after I renamed it before I did anything else. And you see we get the rename option, which just will rename all these underlined instances to the thing I just typed in there. So the Control period hotkey is really useful most of the time. All right, and so I feel that this name is clear, but I will explain. All right. So now, if somebody tries to figure out what happens each frame in fixed update, or each fixed update, I guess I should say, it's not each frame, because fixed update doesn't get called every frame, it gets called every time-based interval. So every fixed update, the camera relative input direction gets determined, and then we update our physics material, then we move based on the camera relative input direction, and then we rotate to face that same direction. So I think that's pretty clear. So that is a little bit of refactoring. Took a little longer than I guess I planned on, just because I wanted to explain some stuff. But if you've never seen this stuff, I think it's useful. So you can add summaries to a class to explain what the class is going to do. You can add a summary to a field to explain what the field is for, and you can add summaries to your methods to explain what the methods are for. So pretty much any member, which is basically anything that is inside of a class, can have a summary. All right, I will see you all next time. Well, I'm going to go ahead and commit this thing. So we can just say what we did here is refactored our character controller to clarify. Yeah, that's good enough. Okay, cool. Let's commit and push that, and I will see you in the next video.